Hey, what's going on, guys? Jack. Back going to talk about the Shrine of the Storms and giving a full dungeon breakdown, a quick run through of everything you need to know as we're going through this instance, especially as we're going to be, putting a lot of focus in on Mythic Plus. All right, starting it off as you're going through it, a lot of the mobs you want to be always watching out for here. Primary ones you want to be watching out for are going to be the Templars. Templars have just a radius effect that causes mobs around them to take considerably less damage, so it's always important to make sure that you either isolate them by pulling all the mobs away from them using, any kind of saps or any kind of prisons. You can even mind control it, just bring it away, anything like that to get it away from the other mobs, burn everything down, or it will be your single target focus. Next mob you always have to watch out for is going to be the Living Current. There's going to be a couple of them as you're moving on to Aquasur, which is going to be the first boss. The Rising Tides cast that it does is not able to be interrupted. It'll basically pick everybody up, stun them, and then drop them back down to the ground really quickly. Just important note, you can line of sight it, but the areas with which you can line of sight it are fairly limited in the room. So you might have to actually drag it a fair distance away, or you might just have your tank get stunned by it and then just have the dispel on them to be able to get them quickly back. But if you, for example, do dispel, they will just start taking fall damage. So important to watch out for as you're encountering with these mobs, and then you're going to be moving on to Aquasur. A lot of tight areas here where you can actually pull extra mobs, so make sure you're kind of sticking to the path and following along with the tank. First boss that you're going to encounter in Shrine of Storm is going to be called Aquasur, or Aquasur. The big thing you want to watch out for as a healer is going to be, of course, the Choking Brine mechanic. And once you dispel that, it will just be a dot, and we'll just start putting out a number of different splashes and little pools out onto the entire platform here. If you hit any of them, they will put out more Choking Brine. So important for everybody to watch their feet here to be able to quickly move out of them. And of course, if you're dispelling multiples at once, if you're using a mass dispel, or for example, if you're going to be using, you can even be using like Blessing of Freedom to be able to get rid of it. Those things will, also increase the threat if you're having multiple ones going off at once. So important for everybody to watch their feet. Otherwise, you have to watch out for the Surging Rush from the boss, which will just charge in one direction and knock you back. It is possible to get knocked off this platform, so very much watch out for that, as well as watching out for the Undertow, which will basically just be the boss casting onto one player and trying to push them back off the platform. In the main intermission phase, the boss will just split into 3 and will continue these different abilities. And that's where you'll also be getting multiple Choking Brines going out at the same time, and have to be working on, watching the rushes coming from 3 different directions as you're going through it. Overall, pretty simple boss and not too difficult to handle. Upon leaving Aquasur's platform, you're going to be encountering a number of different mobs coming up that will be just dealing more AoE damage. The Windspeaker, for example, will put down a Swiftness potion, increasing your haste, but it will also be doing, kind of a Mariner effect out of Maw of Souls, which will just be the Gale Winds just pulsing onto the entire group. There's not too much damage here, so you don't have to worry about it as much, but you will see a couple mobs going forward that will be quite a bit more deadly. You'll have to deal with the Ironhull Apprentices, which of course will just gain a damage buff and then be much slower, so the tanks are going to be focusing on kiting them, or if you're able to have any knockbacks like you're seeing here, it makes it much easier to be able to kind of bring them out, let the tank establish aggro, and then start running away from them as they gain their larger buff. Once you enter, of course, kind of this halfway mark between Aquasur and the Tidesage Council, you will have to deal with one of the Runecarver mobs that's going to be inside the room. You will also put down a damage reduction field where you'll be able to stand in and be able to take, I believe, 75% less damage from his casts. Very important to make sure you're standing in this field if you're going to be being hit by the Runecarve, or the carved flesh, I should say. You really need to make sure you're watching out for it, because it will deal insane amounts of damage to you if you're not standing in the damage reduction field. So if you're standing in the damage reduction field, the damage is pretty much negligible, right? But if you're not, it will absolutely kill you. So important to make sure you're doing that, and also keeping the other mobs out of that damage reduction field, because it will, of course, take much longer for them to deal with. As you're moving across the bridge, you will be encountering, some more mobs that will be replicating some of the Tidesage Council boss effects like we've already seen, enraging themselves and being able to provide a very big damage reduction while being slowed. But you also have to deal with this Guardian Elemental, which will be blocking the bridge. You will also have that sort of Mariner pulsing effect by the Shipbreaker Storm, but you'll also put out one individual electrifying shock onto a player, which increases the damage that they take from the storm. So if you do not dispel it in time, you will have you will just have that player almost precisely just die to the storm itself. So very important to dispel very quickly and get atonement out, getting hats that you need to be able to get out to be able to deal with the storm. And if the damage is really bad, you can just line of sight away from the storm and just kind of sit it out. It'll be very important if you're not going to be able to deal with some of the raging effects or just the larger fortified mobs, depending on the weeks that you're going to be encountering here. Larger pool is going to be coming up. You should be able to group up a lot of these smaller initiates that are kind of surrounding the Tidesage Council. Very easy to be able to kill them quickly. And then, of course, you will be dealing with more of the Ironhull mobs here. So being able to, make the best use out of your space and be able to start moving your way up towards the council. Moving on to the Tidesage Council, you will have 2 bosses to deal with that have separate health pools. You'll have Gale-Colored Fae and Brother Ironhull. Important to note with Fae is that she will be putting down the Swiftness ward like we've already seen, increasing your haste, which can be extremely nice and offering that damage buff, but she's also extremely deadly and very annoying to deal with because she'll be casting the Slicing Blast periodically, and whenever you interrupt these blasts, you will be actually creating more tornadoes. So the Slicing Blast, of course, will just be dealing nature damage to all enemies and increases the nature damage that they take by 20% or 30 seconds, which also stacks. So very important if you're going to let any of these casts go through and try to reduce the amount of tornadoes that you get, to be standing in the defensive ward that Brother Ironhull will be putting up later on. And like we've already seen out of some of his disciples, he will also kind of have that Blessing of Ironsides, which will reduce his movement speed but increase his damage dealt. So not only will the tank be constantly kiting Brother Ironhull, but you have to make a decision as to how much you want to be interrupting the Slicing Blasts depending on the ward that you have down. If you have the haste ward, you might be able to heal through it depending on the level, but if you have the reinforcing ward, the defensive ward, you can also just reduce your damage by standing in it. But the more that you're going to be interrupting, not only is it safer if you're not going to stand in any wards, and safer for the melee who probably won't be able to stand the wards frequently, depending on how much you have to kite Brother Ironhull, but it'll also just create more tornadoes, and those tornadoes do speed up if they're in the Swiftness ward. So important to watch your feet on this fight. It can get very hectic. It's also important to know when your tank has, movement speed increases to be able to get away, because that hindering cleave, if hit by it, will provide a huge movement speed reduction for whoever is hit by it. So that will also make it a lot harder for your tank to kite away. So being able to use, your grip, or being able to have any kind of lock gates or anything extra mobility as needed is very important to watch out for in this fight. Upon killing the Tidesage Council, moving forward, you do have to watch out for a number of different of the Ritualist mobs, as well as the Enforcers. The Ritualists are often surrounded by some small skeletons, which you want to be able to purge off or use Arcane Torrent or Mass Dispel, any of the large shields that they have onto them. So very important to watch out for those. The Enforcers have a deep smash that deals a really large amount of damage and puts pools all over the place, while the Ritualists will start forming these small fields around players, which will explode for some extra damage. So it's very important to make sure you're staying spread out and not being having too many people stacking up in melee, for example, and also knowing when you're going to be able to have to, kite away from the Enforcers and be able to kind of create space whenever you need to there. As you move on to the bridge, leading up to Lord Stormsong, you will have to deal with the Abyssal Cultists. And when you're dealing with the Cultists, you do have to watch out for not only the mental assault, which is the frontal cone that can be the frontal cone that stuns the target and can be dispelled. It has an incredibly large range, so you make sure the tank is facing away from everybody and watching out for that. You will have to deal with the detect thoughts, which will reduce the chance of those targets being hit by different attacks. So more ways that the mob can just reduce its own damage taken, and then it'll also cast Consuming Void on itself, which will absorb damage taken and heal the target. That's buffed by it. So especially as a priest or anybody with a purge, really, you're constantly purging these mobs to make sure that they don't have these buffs, allowing your DPS to just go full on to be able to destroy them. Make sure the tank, like I said, is facing away because the range of the mental assault is extremely large. As you move on to Lord Stormsong here, this fight is fairly simple in that it's very few mechanics you have to watch out for here. The boss will kind of start spamming casting a nuke, a single target nuke that's interruptible onto the tank, which shouldn't deal too much damage for the group or really for the tank. But you'll also periodically spawn little void orbs that will follow one person per orb, and you'll basically be kiting those all the way around the room at a very consistent basis. If you take those, they can deal quite a bit of damage. And then he'll also summon a Mindbender, which will attach itself to one target and silence them. And when that happens, you have to be able to deal as much damage as possible in order to make sure you break them out. As it stands right now in beta, you actually have to deal increasing levels of damage to the target in order to break them out based off of the keystone level. So as you see at a +9, we are almost killing our friend, our ally here, to make sure that he breaks out. If you don't break out in, I believe, 20 seconds, you will be mind controlled and start casting a very large nuke onto the entire group. There's not too much damage going out onto everybody, but the extra damage taken that increases, going out onto the tank, or when you have to spend very large amounts of time focusing in onto whoever is affected by the Mindbender to ensure that they don't get mind controlled, does take a lot of time for the whole group. Ideally, if you're able to actually just start kiting all these orbs into one direction, into one section, it makes it very easy for whoever is affected by the Mindbender to collect all the orbs at once, and then you're just going to focus as much damage as possible into them in order to break it very quickly. As you're leading up to the final boss, Volzith, you will have 3 different mobs that will also be encountered a little bit later in on the encounter here. It will be the Sunken Denizen, which basically just melees and is very slow, deals quite a bit of damage. You might end up having to kite quite frequently. And then you'll have the Forgotten Denizens. The Forgotten Denizens will just be casting this Consuming Essence, which will end up healing them. Very important to make sure that it gets interrupted, but it's an extremely long cast, so it usually isn't too difficult to really worry about. These mobs are going to be interacted with, and you're going to have to fight them again once you go into Volzith's intermission phase here. Volzith, the final boss of Shrine, starts with 60 energy, and upon reaching 100, he will put you into the intermission phase. Important mechanics to watch out for is going to be the Yawning Gale, the gate that does come out. It's just a large void zone that will be covering a very large section of the platform in this room. Make sure that you kind of have a good idea of where all these are going to be spawning, because you'll not be able to see them once you enter the intermission phase. And once you kill the final ad, you will immediately come upstairs into the intermission phase. So if you're in a tyrannical key, for example, and the boss fight lasts a long time, you very well can come up from that intermission phase right in the middle of one of these void zones. So important to keep an eye on those. Whispers of Power will first target the healer, and I believe it targets a random player after that, but it will just be a dispellable debuff which will increase your damage and healing done and continue to stack, but also reduce your maximum HP, or reduce you being able to be healed above a certain percentage, starting at 90% and going up until you're actually dead. Usually I'll go to 6 or 7 stacks here to be able to increase my damage, just long enough to kill the ad that the tank and healer have to deal with in the intermission phase. Then we're going to be ported to the DPS's side, where they have to deal with the other 2 squid mobs that we saw previously. They'll be able to kill those with the rest of the group, and then we'll be able to come back upstairs. You will also see periodically the different tentacles just rising up from the ground. They will then mark a specific area that they will just slam into. Again, watching your feet for those, very important. The last mechanic you always have to watch out for is before the intermission phase. You will have a number of small ads just start moving their way into the boss and trying to be absorbed by the boss. If they're absorbed by the boss, they increase his energy, and if they are killed, they actually deal AoE damage. So it's very important to make sure that if you're killing all of them at once, you not only have to watch out for how you as the healer are handling the debuff, which is increasing your damage and healing, but also is reducing your maximum HP, really making it difficult to stay alive if multiple mobs are getting bursted down. So try to, especially if you do have the damage buff, try to actually kill them individually yourself, so that way the melee DPS especially can just sit onto the boss and maybe get a little bit of help from the range team to help focus those mobs down a little bit easier, start spreading out the damage from it, and allowing you to maintain your damage buff as long as possible here. As you can see, we've completed the dungeon on a +9 difficulty with Tyrannical, Raging, and Necrotic. Very excited to see the next dungeons and next affixes that will be brought to us as we're kind of continuing with the BfA beta coverage. So let me know what you guys think of this quick dungeon guide, and any other suggestions you might have to actually improve it for the future. Thank you so much for tuning in, guys. I hope you all found it useful and informative. I'll catch y'all next time.